Where the average American is born and raised is an important predictor of what level of wealth and social mobility they'll attain in their lifetime. For the average poor black person in the hood, environment makes social mobility nearly impossible. I'll explain how by exploring three categories: employment, credit scores, and housing. But before all that, here's some brief background information. As everyone knows, many neighborhoods were kept segregated throughout the early 20th century using a number of legal and cultural methods. The obvious results were both the Great Migration and the concentration of black communities in urban centers. From LA to Chicago to New York, black communities popped up and grew in number. These communities were not built with reparations from slavery, and most residents had not inherited money from ancestors who benefited from slavery. Let's fast forward. So in the late 60s and 70s, across the country, you've got black enclaves in cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, St. Louis, Akron, and more. While conditions are far from perfect, there are quality jobs available for blue-collar laborers until deindustrialization. More blue-collar jobs move overseas, and a national oil crisis and recession during the 70s further impacts a population already disproportionately impoverished. Black neighborhoods, historically redlined and usually denied access to affordable mortgages and business loans, are hit especially hard. During this period, like in every period from the 1960s to now, the black unemployment rate is over twice the rate of white unemployment. Chronic unemployment and poverty have butterfly effects like hunger, hopelessness, and depression, which experts have linked to violence and drug abuse. It also didn't help that states were eager to purge their welfare rolls and neglect public housing, two social safety nets that the white community was entitled to, along with post-World War II GI benefits in the mid-20th century. These things helped build the white middle class, but were suddenly seen as programs for the lazy when more black people were given public assistance beginning in the late 60s. And so the legend of the welfare queen flourished throughout the 70s and into the Reagan years. During the 80s, the hood was damaged by the war on drugs, with neighborhoods becoming over-policed and violent. Because black people, especially black men, are more likely to face discrimination from police and get criminal records, this directly impacts employment opportunities, a fact that holds true to this day. Think about all the minimum wage and entry-level jobs that ask applicants if they have felony convictions, and also remember that America, the land of the free, has more imprisoned people than any country in the world. In the 90s, banks began entering redline black neighborhoods and offering shoddy mortgages and loans with extremely high interest rates, leading to foreclosures. And since public housing was on the decline, this meant more poor black people were turning towards the private housing market. Low property taxes damaged the already thin budgets of mainly black schools. Severely under-resourced schools contribute to decreased social mobility and severely limit the future employment opportunities of black children. This was also the time that welfare programs were gutted of their effectiveness when control over who got what was given back to states, who have historically racist records of discriminating against black people. This is why we originally needed federal regulation in the first place. Millions of Americans were left without a public safety net. So let's get into it. How does zip code intertwine with unemployment, poor credit scores, and lack of adequate housing to keep the cycle of poverty thriving in the black community here in 2019? As I've already said, the black unemployment rate for the past 60 years has been over double the white unemployment rate. To survive, unemployed people turn towards crime, welfare, or odd jobs. Odd jobs can be backbreaking, unregulated labor for minuscule pay. But when black people in the hood have jobs, are their wages even enough to cover the bills? 1 in 9 American workers are paid wages that would leave them in poverty even with a full-time year-round schedule. This means they earn poverty wages. 8.6% of white workers are poverty wage earners compared to 14.3% of black workers. In the hood, where many of the jobs available in abundance for those without expensive college degrees are fast food and retail, industries that are infamous for underpaying their workers, this demonstrates that the issue of black poverty doesn't start or end with unemployment. Jobs must be well-paying and offer benefits. Because many of these jobs don't offer things like health coverage, it's not surprising that more than half of all black people have medical debt on their credit cards. Lack of healthcare coverage matters, especially since predominantly black communities are regularly nestled near toxic factories, garbage dumps, and located in food deserts. Oh, and I should also mention that when public transportation is poor poor in predominantly black areas or doesn't exist in areas with well-paying jobs, those who rely on it to get to work face higher chances of job termination or lost wages or lost job opportunities. Let's also not forget that because many jobs in the hood don't pay well enough, working parents often get second jobs and spend less time with their children. This means less quality time, less parental supervision, less help with homework or involvement at school, and increased stress. Increased stress and less leisure time is linked to child abuse and neglect, which in turn is linked to acting out in school, intimate partner abuse, and petty crime. So when you're employed but your job barely pays you, where do you turn in the case of emergencies? How do you get things that are often highly necessary like childcare, cars, or preventative health care? Particularly in the 90s and beyond, dire circumstances meant black people turned to high-interest credit cards, which led to high consumer debt, which funds the lucrative debt-buying industry, in which companies buy debts and then bring up collection suits disproportionately among black people. Judgments from collection suits determine how much one owes on a debt or how much their wages will be garnished. A study found that the amounts were twice as high in mostly black communities compared to white ones. Getting sick and paying for an emergency medical procedure, or waking up one day to a busted transmission and buying a new one so that you can continue going to work and avoid being fired, can mean missing a bill, having your debt sent to collections, and getting your check garnished. Among families barely above the poverty line, a garnished check can mean being short on rent, utilities, or other basic necessities like food. The same study found that debt collection suits in black neighborhoods were 20 to 25% smaller than debts from white neighborhoods, but companies still pursue black debts more often. When credit scores are compromised, black people in emergency situations turn to payday loan places and pawn shops for high interest loans. Both of these places are disproportionately located in communities of color. 17% of blacks compared to 5% of whites use non-traditional credit like pawn shops and payday loans. One of the pioneers of the modern payday loan industry is W. Allen Jones, who along with others in 1999 spent over $500,000 lobbying Congress to deregulate the industry, said in a 2010 interview that his city of Cleveland, Tennessee had just enough blacks to make a decent basketball team, but not enough to worry about crime. Clearly, his business model helps keep Negroes out of his neck of the woods. In addition to all of this, constantly needing money for late fees, emergencies, and healthcare can make it nearly impossible to save a substantial sum of money or to even keep up with life insurance policies. As we know, life insurance policies are crucial for future generations to inherit wealth and pay for funerals of their loved ones without they themselves going into debt. This is especially challenging when you consider that black people are 4 times more likely than whites to cash their own life insurance policies early to cover an unexpected expense. At the end of the day, you probably want a place to live. For black people who, as we've discussed, face significant obstacles in obtaining well-paying employment and low-interest loans, finding housing can be challenging. In fact, finding adequate housing is difficult for all poor people, as prices have shot up drastically in the past few decades, and they've increasingly come to rely on the private market rather than public housing. Most poor renting families spend over half of their income on housing, and at least 1 in 4 spends over 70% of their income on housing and utilities, leaving very little left over for food, transportation, childcare, healthcare, and other requirements for quality living. This is despite the fact that for nearly a century, experts have agreed that families should spend no more than 30% of their income on housing. But that's not all. For starters, contract selling is making a comeback. This was a common scam presented by whites to the black community from the 1930s to 60s, where buyers who couldn't get conventional loans from banks would make monthly payments to a seller with the promise of a deed in 20 to 30 years when the property was paid off. In those situations, the contract buyer or renter has few legal protections, builds no home equity in the process, and can be easily evicted for something like not keeping up with the expensive housing codes they, not the landlords, are obligated to fix. When evicted, the entire investment a family made into the house is gone. This practice is seeing a resurgence in black communities, with investors buying thousands of foreclosed homes in areas like Detroit and Akron. Let's not forget banks like Wells Fargo issuing high-interest subprime loans to the black community in the 2000s. When people fell behind on payments, they were evicted and still left in debt. In 2006, before the housing market bubble burst, Wells Fargo originated or co-issued $74.2 billion worth of subprime loans, making it one of the top subprime lenders in the country. By June 2010, Wells Fargo had $17.5 billion worth of foreclosed homes on its books, making it one of the nation's 3 top banks in foreclosure activity. Eviction used to be a rare occurrence in the 20th century, but is now a near-daily reality in cities like Milwaukee, Kansas City, Cleveland, and Chicago. The evicted are disproportionately black. Eviction is rough for a number of reasons. For one, evictions means less putting down roots, less sustained inter-community relationships, and an increase in resentment and disinvestment, meaning people are less likely to care about the neighborhoods they live in and become less interested in helping the community through political or civic involvement. Evicted people get monstrous red flags on their credit reports and rental histories, meaning they're more likely to end up homeless or in substandard housing. People living in substandard housing often have landlords who refuse to fix housing hazards. And when and if these poor people fall behind in rent and live upon their landlord's mercy, they can't call a building inspector or complain too much, because then they can end up evicted again. In many areas, landlords can even evict tenants for nuisances like too many 911 calls or police appearances. For black women dealing with domestic violence, this means making the choice between calling the police when an abusive lover shows up at the door and being evicted, or taking the chance of being beat up and possibly being kicked out anyways when a neighbor calls the cops out of concern. In many cases, the landlords are legally required to evict tenants in these situations, as cities wishing to reduce their law enforcement budgets will penalize landlords with fines, property forfeiture, or revoke licenses if they don't keep tenants from calling the police. Landlords can afford to equip lawyers in housing court, while tenants, who if they are able to get off work to attend court in the first place, can't afford lawyers. To make matters worse, under the current administration, funding for public housing is being severely reduced. If we don't address stagnant wages in the job market, predatory banks and lending places, the underregulated private housing market, and the dissolution of welfare programs, cycles of poverty will continue to flourish in the black community. Crime for survival will continue, inevitably feeding the prison industrial complex, and black couples and women who might otherwise want children will continue to put off doing so. We can't keep telling poor black people to work or save their way out of poverty, when the system is clearly designed to keep them in it.